people within the community, the people who are responding to the police brutality that is causing police officers to be a bit sensitive. Because if you have a gun, then obviously police is going to respond to a certain extent. So therefore, their problem does nothing to solve the solution, because primarily speaking, people are still going to react to a certain, they're going to be at the heat of the moment, which is something that the Prime Minister has emphasized. No, thank you, sir. His second argument was a discussion upon how there's going to be increased qualification because of a physical presence. Their first argument was to talk about, like, you can't talk if you don't have a hijab. Mr. Speaker, that's fundamentally untrue, and let alone the fact that you do not need this policy in order for individuals to cooperate. Right? If you don't need 20%. Their argument is not to prove why you need one person. You need 20% of the minority in order to have a discussion, and this discussion can still occur within the status quo, because if you want hijab, then you can have hijab. It's your burden to prove why you need 20%. But second of all, Mr. Speaker, the alliance argument. If you look at your flow, literally your notes, it is literally an assertion. There was no reason to back the idea about why there is going to be an alliance between, like, black officers and white officers. Well, I'll discuss upon why this alliance is going to decrease. All right, but no, thank you, sir. Remaining arguments will be integrated. You're good at that. You know that I can do it as well. No, thank you, sir. All right, let's first discuss upon why this further emphasizes that race matters. Because, Mr. Speaker, on a principle level, we think that creating hiring and firing policies based on uncontrollable factors such as race is intrinsically bad against liberal democracies. Okay, you don't discriminate based on race, you don't discriminate based on gender or religion, which is technically uncontrollable to a certain extent. The problem that exists within the affirmative side's model is that not only are you discriminating individuals based on race and saying that you are less qualified to work within this community, but second of all, race is now a necessary condition in order to represent the voice. This increases the rhetoric in saying that race is necessary. This race, only black people, only white people are capable of representing the voices of the minority within the status quo. We think that this is problematic on multiple reasons. Not only because it reinforces, like, gender or, like, discriminatory stereotypes within the status quo, but it also decreases incentive to change within society. Now white people have less incentive to change because they can just, like, yield the responsibility to another individual. They can yield the responsibility to another black person because it's their role, it's their responsibility in order to represent these particular districts. We think that on a principle level, this is very problematic, as we've discussed before, because it hinders racial, like, integration within society, but additionally it also causes multiple problems on the incentive structure that exists within policy in general. Let's move on to our second substantive, which is upon why representation is going to be difficult. So not only is efficacy a problem, but it's also going to lead to multiple consequences. There are two reasons why. First of all, we think that the trust toward representation is going to decrease. No, thank you, sir. Primarily because what you need to understand is that if your characterization is to say that people are killing cops, like, it is so violent to the extent that there are gangsters who are killing and selectively killing cops, we think that the trust towards the representatives within the police force is not necessarily going to exist. Because as you see, Mr. Speaker, they are perceived as the enemy because they are part of the police force. They are part of the group that they consider to be individuals who we need to kill within status quo, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, because they are perceived as the enemy, there is going to be an elitist ideal towards these individuals. So the possibility for you to listen to these people relatively decreases, and let alone the fact that you won't feel safe within these particular communities. But second of all, we also need to recognize the characteristics that exist within police offices. There is a hierarchy. There is a clear hierarchical structure that exists within these particular areas. So you start as a very, very low rank. You start as a private first or private second class within the military. We think that if you are a very low rank, it's very difficult to change structures that exist within society, especially because these police forces already have white people who are apparently extremely racist against African Americans. An African American police officer that tells this captain that you shouldn't do this, that type of hierarchical structure is impossible to change as an individual within society. But second of all, we think that the cooperation that the affirmative side wants to discuss about is going to be non-existent, because in the perception or in the eyes of white police officers, these are individuals who didn't necessarily come based on their skill set, but they came because of their race, Mr. Speaker. So as a result, we think that there's going to be even more division between black police officers and white police officers, because the perception of affirmative action and the necessity in order to, like, become that police officer necessarily increases. So, Mr. Speaker, rather than having better representation within status quo, we think that the likely scenario is that the white captives who are oppressive towards the African Americans, they're going to delegate very petty jobs towards these black police officers. You know, if you see Zootopia, you know, Judy gets to become a ticket officer as compared to actually going on the force. So the possibility for you to be distributed on petty things that don't necessarily represent the voice of the minorities is going to be a higher or a more possible scenario, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, because our side of the house is better in addressing the problems that they want to identify, proud to oppose.
Speaker for 32 seconds. I think the leader of opposition. Now, Deputy Crown Minister.
Judy got a more important job to prove herself. Why can't that happen in Baguilat? Yeah. Like the Zootopia example is totally against them.
Do you really want me?
I'm gonna say it in my reply, so save it for me.
Come on.
Peace.
At the point at which side opposition comes up to the podium and tells us that we need to instead support grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter, they fail to acknowledge the fact that white police brutality is precisely what gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, Mr. Speaker. We think that the problem on their side is that they acknowledge that there is racial tension, that they acknowledge that there is division that is based on race, but they simply try to brush that away and blindly ignore that. We think that to an extent, acknowledging those differences and trying to ameliorate that sort of division is what is necessary given the status quo. We can't simply ignore the problem and say that we should be cooperative, like no matter what, right? So before we move on into a third argument about why this is going to ease the career entrance for other demographic minorities, such as racial and religious minorities, we're going to be asking two questions in today's debate. Number one, about the principal justification of whether the government can actually do this, but number two, about is this going to be effective in terms of alleviating racial tensions in communities. So on to the first clash about principal justification. So side opposition once again talked about movements like Black Lives Matter, right? We want to make it very clear why this is not going to work. Because for two reasons. Number one, because the very idea of Black Lives Matter movement requires publicity. Where is that publicity gained, Mr. Speaker? We think that publicity is ultimately gained by protests, which ultimately requires the involvement of the state, right? You have to tell the state, you have to report to the police that I will be protesting at a specific instance, at a specific time and location, right? Once the police is antagonized against you, you are automatically incentivized to block that movement from occurring, to block that protest in the first place. So it's impossible for that grassroots movement to occur without the cooperation of the police. No, thank you. But second of all, the reason why this doesn't work is because it hasn't worked for decades, right? This tension already exists in the status quo, and you're simply ignoring that. We think that education of white police does not necessarily refute the empirical evidence that these black people have experienced, that their sons and daughters dying and being shot to death by white police. We don't think that that sort of visceral experience can be necessarily refuted by the fact that these white police have been educated adequately. No, thank you. So our first argument, right? We talked about the principal justification. We gave these several levels of analysis. The only response that side opposition gave to this entire argument is that sometimes black officers actually harm white people. It's about how people react, not necessarily about the races of the victims and the criminals. First of all, we think that this is about as ridiculous as saying that men fear women in the back alleys of India, right? That's simply statistically untrue. If you look at all news reports of police violence, it is almost always, 99.99% of the time, white people harassing black individuals and ultimately the black community protesting against that. So it's just like a disingenuous characterization of the status quo on their side, right? But second of all, we think that they completely ignore the extra dimension of analysis that we provided in the second argument, right? Where we talked about why it's not necessarily just about racial tensions, it's also about sensitivity to cultural norms. Whereas a Muslim woman, you are much more likely to report like a crime of sexual harassment to a fellow Muslim woman who looks just like you and shares the same religious and racial beliefs, right? Instead of talking to a white male police officer with whom you share literally nothing in common. No, thank you. So when it comes to their first argument, which is about like emphasizing that race matters, yes, we do want to emphasize that race matters. We don't want to brush it away and say that race doesn't matter because it does matter in the status quo. You can't change the fact through education that black people don't like white police officers in the status quo. That simply will not change, right? So given that that social perception is already there and is inevitable, we think that perhaps perhaps it's an impact that we want to advocate on our side to actually ameliorate that sort of tension and to allow that us versus them mentality to gradually dissolve. How do you do that? We don't do that by automatically integrating them and saying, white police officers, black people, you should get along together, because that already hasn't worked, right? The solution of this debate, Mr. Speaker, that we propose is to initially allow black people to become more open to police force in the first place by allowing them to interact with people of their race and religion. Once they are more open to cooperation, at that point, only at that point, can we ultimately achieve full cooperation between all sorts of races, right? So the last thing that they talk about here is that white people have less incentive to change. Number one, we are going to perform police education. We're not necessarily going to allow a situation in which a white police officer takes charge of the entire police group and says, a black person, you are only going to take care of traffic tickets, right? That's simply something that we can solve from the top down. But furthermore, the entire point of our case is to change the culture from within. Part of the reason why these white police officers are so antagonized against black people is because they're not friends with any of them. They don't know any black people. They don't interact with them on a regular basis. So humanizing them is the most important aspect in terms of cooperation within the police force. We achieve that, they're the ones who ignore the problem. And on to the second clash, right? In our second argument, we talked about why it's ultimately better for us to acknowledge these sorts of cultural norms and to acknowledge that and allow police officers to accommodate that. Only response inside opposition, then why do you need 20%? That we haven't fully proved our burden. So number one, is it okay if it's 5%? Is it okay if the quota is 1 or 2 people? But second of all, to directly respond to their case, right? It's important to be proportionate. If 20% of the crimes in that community, no thank you, are committed by black people, then it's important that 20% of legal enforcement is actually corresponding to that sort of crime and interacting with these individuals, right? If there's only one black police officer dealing with 100 black people or predominantly black population, we don't think that our principle stands. And that's the reason, the practical reason behind our model. But the second thing that they told us in their second argument is that it decreases trust in representatives. Because first of all, they're perceived as an enemy. So this example of snitching, where the black police officer is viewed as going against the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Number one, on the comparative, it's significantly worse for a white police officer to become involved, because in that case, it's glaringly obvious that crime is racially motivated. But second of all, they completely ignore the level of analysis in our last argument when we said that after things like vigilantism, which will naturally arise if white police officers continue to perpetuate these sorts of actions, actually makes the problem worse. No thank you. So it's better for the police to at least cooperate on a practical, prima facie level, rather than allowing them to be perceived as the enemy. So, do we think that the trust to representatives is significantly worse under their side of the debate? So, on to our third argument about why this eases career entrance for demographic minorities in the future and why that's so beneficial. So the problem in the status quo, as both sides agree in today's debate, is that the barrier for entering these police jobs in law enforcement is insanely high for minorities. Once there is no specific quota, once we just say that black people, you're welcome to apply, but no one's going to be here who shares the same race and religion with you, they run the risk of entering the police force and being the only one serving in that single community, right? So without that guaranteed camaraderie, Mr. Speaker, we create the stigma that systematically bars racial and religious minorities from entering the police force. We view our policy as a way to sort of break that ceiling and create some sort of cushion, and that these individuals become more comfortable entering the police force voluntarily in the future. We think that this is the same way that affirmative action in, for example, college education works. If low-income first-generation students go to college, then they show their community, they show their friends and children that this is possible. It sets a precedent. So in this way, we want to make being part of legal enforcement a career option for future black police officers, for future Muslim police officers. We ultimately think that this is the most gradual grassroots, the best grassroots way of going about this movement. And for all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 27 seconds. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Now we call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we need to be very clear about the burden of proof on the government side. Now, the first and the biggest burden of proof that they need to fulfill is why does that representation need to be necessarily exactly proportionate to the demography of these minorities? Now, first of all, they fail to explain the need in the first place. And secondly, their explanation on the solvency is very vague, right? Because increasing the current proportion of black officers within the forces right now to 11% to 16%, that's not suddenly going to have a groundbreaking change in the way justice system is delivered to these citizens. Why? Because the problem is much more complex than the government can fathom, right? With their limited brains. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the problem between police officers and gang members and racial minorities and ethnic minorities is much more encompassing than simply race or religion. And we need to understand regional differences. We need to understand the dynamics between officers and individuals, and officers and civilians, and gang organizations and police officers to correctly assess this problem, which I will further elaborate in my argumentation. And furthermore, they also talked about how it's suddenly going to, create an alliance between the forces, right? But that's not going to happen, right? The only assumption or the explanation they had is that now they can be friends, right? Because instead of having 11 friends that are black, I'm going to have 16 partners that are black, right? That's not going to change with the status quo that they're proposing. And on top of that, what it does is that the second speaker told us, it lowers the entry barriers. In the case of most affirmative action cases, what it does is that it creates a dichotomy between officers who are entered with enough qualifications and officers who are entered through these affirmative action policies. And yes, Junbin did talk about you're going to pass the standard, but obviously out of a need, you're going to have to lower the standard to a certain degree. That's what reality is. Stop debating on La La Land, ladies and gentlemen. And on top of that, ladies and gentlemen, they also talked about revenge, about police vigilantism. No, thank you, sir. But even according to their policy, when still 80% of the police forces are white, then there's still going to be 80% of the police forces who are still targets of these vigilantism. And on top of that, if you feel that for black crimes, black officers need to be there, then it makes a freaking ineffective police force. Why? Because when a crime occurs, only a small minority is there to respond to these crimes, which makes an inherently ineffective police force in the first place. And on top of that, ladies and gentlemen, the characterization is that now when black officers or Muslim officers confront black criminals or Muslim criminals, they're going to be really nice, right? But that's not going to happen, right? Because these criminals are not going to think, oh, that brother is not going to arrest me, right? Because why? The characterization and the job of these officers is to arrest them, is to point a gun at them if they're armed, and all that kind of things. And if these, as they characterize, these officers give them assurance, we think that's a bigger problem. Why? Because that's proof that these police officers are not carrying out the law properly. And there's disproportionate, no thank you, disproportionate, your speech was shame. There was disproportionate